Imagine if you were forbidden from exercising your rights simply because of the color of your skin. Would you stand up and fight for what you know rightfully belongs to you? That's what the Freedom Riders did. For decades, seating on buses, station waiting rooms, restrooms, and restaurants have been racially segregated between the black and white community in the United States. Starting with an integrated group of 13 activists and growing to beyond 400, the Freedom Riders aim to change this. The Freedom Riders nonviolently protested segregated interstate bus travel despite the inevitable violent response, displayed how whites and blacks can fight together for civil rights, and drew media attention to the immediate need for Southern desegregation. Yet this great civil rights movement could not have possibly sprung out of nowhere. Its roots could be traced far back, to the early 1900s. In the South, which once thrived with a system of slavery, blacks face oppression due to the anti-black laws known as Jim Crow laws. These laws focus on segregating the black and white races, separating their use of public facilities. Such laws were able to last decades due to the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case. In Louisiana, Homer Plessy, who was 1/8 African American, was charged with violation of a state law and arrested after sitting in a whites-only railroad cart. After bringing the case to the Supreme Court, it was ultimately ruled that Louisiana had the right to regulate interstate transportation, legalizing the separate but equal ideology that supported Jim Crow. In an effort to challenge this ideology, the civil rights movement began an era of nonviolent protests. This idea of peaceful protesting can be traced back to World War II. Black soldiers fought for freedom and justice in other countries, yet they lacked equality in the US. During the war, A. Philip Randolph led the March on Washington movement in 1941 to demand a ban in discrimination in the defense industry. The threat of this march convinced President Roosevelt to issue Executive Order 8802, which banned segregation in the armed forces. This was the first major victory in the fight for equality. Various legal cases were also used to fight against segregation, one of which was the 1946 Morgan v. Virginia case, in which Irene Morgan directly challenged the segregation of interstate travel. She won with the help of Thurgood Marshall, who was part of the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, a black advocacy group who provided legal help. However, the ruling of this case was largely disregarded by the South. In 1947, a movement known as the Journey of Reconciliation would serve as inspiration for the 1961 Freedom Rides. The 1947 Journey of Reconciliation, a nonviolent civil rights movement, tested the ruling of the 1946 Morgan v. Virginia case. Organized by the Congress of Racial Equality and Fellowship of Reconciliation, 8 whites and 8 blacks traveled on interstate buses. However, this was largely unsuccessful. On May 4th of 1961, CORE, led by activist James Farmer, organized the first Freedom Rides. Their goal was to test the authenticity of the Boynton v. Virginia ruling. This case followed Bruce Boynton, a black man who was arrested for sitting in a whites-only section of a restaurant in a bus terminal. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Boynton, stating that interstate bus terminal segregation was unconstitutional and violated the Interstate Commerce Act. However, once again, the integrationist ruling was largely ignored by the Southern white supremacists, who met the Freedom Riders with violent hostility. Well aware of the consequences, the Riders took a stand against segregation by launching themselves into the fight for integration in the American South. During course training before the Freedom Rides, the Riders were told to accept arrest and violence. Many of the Riders did not previously believe in nonviolence. They were raised with a mindset of retaliating when attacked. To be now told that somebody's gonna slap me, and spit on me, and throw water on me, and I'm not to do anything about it, is against my human nature. Hank Thomas, a Freedom Rider. Despite this, in bus terminal restaurant sit-ins, the riders ordered their food and sat as if nothing was out of ordinary. In the cases where restaurant owners asked the group to leave, the group would simply rise and exit the building in an orderly fashion. Though the protesters did not use violence, their opposition was not the same. On Mother's Day 1961, the Freedom Riders arrived in Anniston, Alabama. Approximately 200 whites, many of them Ku Klux Klan members, attacked the bus, bearing bricks and bats. The bus was stopped, and the segregationists took this opportunity to throw rocks, shattering the windows, allowing for a Molotov cocktail to be thrown in, setting the bus on fire. Riders streamed out of the bus, where the mob attacked them with stones and bricks.
I knew if I got off the bus, I knew the mob would kill me.
The Freedom Riders, victims of violence and taunts in their tour of the South to test segregation at Interstate Bus Depot, were determined to ride on further into the Deep South yesterday, Monday, despite beatings, stonings, and maulings Sunday in Anniston and Birmingham. The Philadelphia Tribune, 1961.
I was hit in the head with a wooden crate and left lying there in a pool of blood.
On May 17, 1961, Nashville students that joined the Freedom Ride took a bus to Birmingham, where they were arrested by Police Chief Bo Connor. They kept up morale by singing freedom songs. Soon after, the students were driven back up to the Tennessee line. The Freedom Riders repeatedly withstood white violence without retaliation. However, there were whites on their side too.
Nonviolence is the only way. Gandhi had proved it, and Dr. King in the Montgomery movement had proved that these tactics work.
In the first place, this is not just a Southern battle. It is a fight of great importance to Negroes all over the country because even if there's only one spot in which the Negro is degraded because of his color, it must be the concern of every Negro and of every white who has any sense of decency. Ruth Silver, a Freedom Rider. Although much of the white population exhibited hostility towards the Freedom Riders, there were many who joined the movement as well. During the rides, whites would sit in the back of the bus where blacks should sit, and blacks sat in the front where whites should sit. Even after the arrest of several Freedom Riders, the activists continued to meet and perform demonstrations, sometimes aided by local citizens, both white and black. In many of these integrated protests, both the black and white activists were arrested and beaten. On May 25th of 1961, 4 whites and 3 blacks were arrested for breach of peace in Montgomery, Alabama. From the very beginning, the Freedom Rides were supported by both blacks and whites, with the first Freedom Riders consisting of 13 members, 7 blacks and 6 whites, and as the movement grew, support from the white community grew as well. The reason behind the growing support could be attributed to the media attention. By drawing media attention, the Freedom Riders revealed the extremity of Southern segregation to the rest of the nation. They provided the civil rights movement with perhaps its highest level of national media attention ever, especially in the North. Stories of the horrific violence in the South spread. The fact that peaceful protesters were met with such a violent response drew great attention from the northern states. It became more evident than ever that they needed to step in and stop this violence. The South had its chance for the past 96 years to develop Negro civil rights through education and understanding. And these freedom rides only make it vividly clear. Change has not come. Ruth Silver. When violence erupted on Mother's Day of 1961 in Anniston, Alabama, attention was drawn to a need for action in the South. The mass violence occurred due to the Birmingham Public Safety Commissioner, Bo Connor, not posting any police protection beforehand. The greatest faults lay with the law officials. They did little to nothing while angry mobs beat us. Genevieve Hughes, a freedom rider. Northern newspapers attacked the Alabama governor John Patterson, calling him a white supremacist who was directly responsible for this incident due to his reluctance to protect the Freedom Riders. The newspaper claimed that so long as this nation supports or accepts the segregation in the southern states, this sort of violence will continue. Another article was directed towards the national government itself, stating that America could not progress so long as this nation's leader permit these kind of incidents to continue, and called for less talk and more action. The media attention attracted by this violence not only made national but also worldwide headlines, the world watching horror as pictures of the burning bus, of riders lying unconsciously on the ground, and of bruised and battered college students were published. The images disturbed many, including several of the US's international diplomats, and created a large amount of negative publicity for the United States. The Freedom Riders had taken a stand, and they had let the world know it. As a result of the media attention, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy demanded the Interstate Commerce Commission (ICC) to regulate the desegregation of buses and bus terminals. On November 1, 1961, the ICC declared that in every method of transportation, everyone, regardless of their skin color, would have equal rights. Segregation signs had to be taken down in bus terminals. This was strictly enforced and tested by following Freedom Riders. The first Freedom Riders had inspired numerous activists to become Freedom Riders, teaching the younger generation that they, too, could change the way their country worked. First Freedom Riders were beaten bloody, but they inspired a movement. New Orleans journalist Katie Rickdell. In fact, 3 months after the desegregation regulation was passed, Freedom Riders visited 80 southern bus terminals. The Freedom Riders grew from being a core project to something bigger that brought people together. The Freedom Rides illustrated how much nonviolent protest could achieve, drawing attention to the struggle for equality in America, with the whole world watching to see what would happen next. The reality that nonviolent protest could bring about change and constructive change, to me, is what really was the difference and the ultimate impact of the Freedom Rides. Jim Zorg, Freedom Rider. The Freedom Riders showed that any and all ordinary citizens could do something to change the way their country worked. The impact of the Freedom Rides ultimately led to the civil rights accomplishments such as the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The Freedom Riders didn't just desegregate the bus terminals, they led an era of nonviolent civil rights movement.